And it's really interesting when you get to Christianity, because first of all, even in the ancient Near Eastern world that I mentioned in the Old Testament, you have this idea that both men and women are created in the image of God. It says male and female, he created them. And so right really on the very first few pages of the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, you have a level of agency applied to women that they are also created in the image of God. And that was revolutionary in the ancient world, that women would have been seen on this sort of equal footing and standard as men. And when we zoom ahead and get to Jesus, when we look at the life of Jesus, what we see is that right from the beginning, he radically deferred from the cultural context in regard to this conversation of women. And Jesus was a constant advocate for the agency and equality of women. He talked with women. So in John 4 and Mark 7 and Matthew 9 and Mark 5 and Luke 8, we see all these times where Jesus is discussing various topics with women. He's encouraging towards women in all of the Gospels: Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 7, John 12, and lifting up women of social and economic and even sexual standing, women who were viewed as sort of objects in a sense through prostitution and things like that. He elevates them, and women have they learned at Jesus's feet throughout the Gospels. In fact, in Luke 10, we get an example of that. Luke 10, verse 39, and a concept that would have been seen as radical in the first century, both in Roman and Jewish settings, for a woman to sit at the feet of a rabbi, of a teacher. That was pretty revolutionary. And it's also interesting that we see, taking a glance at the records of early Christianity, one thing that stands out very starkly is that the early Christian movement was almost entirely made up of women. And this is surprising for a number of reasons. And one of the first is chiefly being that the population of the Greco-Roman world was predominantly male. So maternal death in childbirth was high. The gender selective infanticidal traditions was common practice when it came to girls. In fact, there was a Roman practice known as exposure, which is essentially an ancient form of abortion, where the woman would give birth, and if it was female, they would leave them near the garbage dumps at the outside of the city. And Christians were famous for saving these babies, for raising them as their own. And all of these sorts of different factors made Roman society disproportionately male. And yet, Christianity was predominantly female in its earliest forms. And I think one of the big reasons for that was that it gave agency to women in particular. The teachings of Jesus and the idea that not only were both male and female created in the image of God, but then women, Christ died for all. He died for the male and the female. And then, as we'll probably talk a little bit more, Paul sort of explicates this in saying that when you come to the table of fellowship, there is no male nor female. Not that those genders don't exist or that they're brushed over, but that we are made one in our equality status through Christ. And this was so obvious that when the Roman magistrate, Pliny the Younger, wanted to know more about Christianity, it said that he interrogated two female slaves who were known as deaconesses. He's looking for leaders within the early church movement, and he's actually going to particular individuals who are women. There's another ancient writer named Celsus, who's a second century philosopher, and he's a vocal proponent against women, or against Christianity, sorry. And he remarks that, and here's another quote: Christians want and are able to convince only the foolish, dishonorable, and stupid, only the slaves, the women, and the little children. He sort of packs them all into the same category. And this is meant to mock them. It's nobody believes that but the women. And I think we can look at that and we can see, wow, that stands out in that world. But in a world today where we do have far more equality than arguably we've ever had between the sexes, we can look at this and see a lot of that trickle down comes from these Judeo-Christian concepts. I mean, let that sink in for a moment. Christianity was mocked for being too pro-women in the ancient world. Literally, the objections were, they're too full of women. And ancient writers like Lucian and Celsus, they dismissively castigate Christianity as such. And actually, it's interesting, when Christianity was eventually decriminalized by Emperor Constantine in 312 AD, what's referred to as the Edict of Milan, and Christians were given the ability to hold political standing. Along with that, laws were placed on the books for the first time that protected women and children from abuse. And 1 year after that, in AD 313, infanticide was outlawed. And then shortly after that, in 321, financial provision for single and poor women and was given. If for no other reason, then there was a practice in the ancient world where if women were, if they were divorced unfairly, or if they became widows, or if they fell into economic collapse, they would often sell their children for subsistence. And these sort of social safety nets were put into place by the government, particularly through the Christian means, to prevent this, to outlaw it. And in 428, actually, there was a law against pimps, fathers, and slave owners who were exploiting women for sex. That was condemned and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And that's the first time in the ancient world that we really start to see those things. And that's what I mean by giving agency. The progression of equality, mind you, was slow in Rome. Wasn't built in a day. But a lot of its social institutions that were pervasive, these things took time to chip away. There's no denying that. But eventually what we see is the Christian worldview starting to permeate the ancient world. You don't get these sorts of laws passed. You don't get this idea that men and women are created equal anywhere in the ancient world. And I would actually advocate also the modern world, aside from the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's where it comes from. You wouldn't naturally get these ideas. Like I said, those hierarchies of the kings and the emperors being on top, and then the social stratus, and then really women, little children, slaves, barbarians, those types of people, they're on the very bottom. That is how the ancient world saw it. And it's when we start to see Christianity permeating throughout the society that we start to see equality. And that's where we start to see that there's no denying that the growth and prevalence of Christianity, and its understanding that all are made in the image of God, right? Like I said, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And that, as I mentioned also in Galatians 3:28, Paul says that in Christ there is no male nor female. These types of ideas, they completely revolutionized the ancient world's understanding of equality and particularly value when it came to women.